Good day, all. This talk will examine the subjectivist analysis of the criminal justice system. Subjectivism seeks to understand crime and criminal justice by getting inside the heads of criminals and crime fighters. Subjectivism argues that everyone acts on the basis of their self-image. In other words, people's actions are based on what kind of person they think they are. So, for example, if someone thinks of himself as a tough guy or a bad boy, then he'll be much more likely to engage in violence than someone who thinks of himself as a nerd or a wimp. Or even more directly, if someone thinks of himself as a professional criminal, then he'll be much more likely to engage in crime than someone who thinks of himself as a law-abiding citizen. So the question then becomes, how do some people develop a criminal self-image? In trying to answer this question, many subjectivists have come to the conclusion that, unfortunately, the criminal justice system often inadvertently promotes this criminal self-image. In the late 1930s, Franklin Tannenbaum, like so many of the theorists we've looked at, examined the issue of juvenile delinquency with the goal of understanding how these teens developed a criminal self-image. Tannenbaum concluded that the trouble with kids is that they have far more energy than adults know what to do with. Kids go out on the streets, run around, make noise, break things, and generally disturb the peace of adults who get upset and may call the police. Also, said Tannenbaum, teenagers have to test their limits. They have to find out for themselves just what they can get away with and what they can't get away with. This means that teenagers will normally break the law in minor ways, such as skipping school, petty vandalism, petty theft, stealing comic books and candy bars and stuff like that. I know that I did stuff like that when I was a teenager, and I asked my students if they did it for over 30 years, and I can guarantee you, almost everybody does it. As Tannenbaum said, it's normal. Moreover, it's a phase. It's something that kids do. Once you become an adult, you leave such childish things behind. So, if adults just leave the kids alone, they will grow out of it. But, said Tannenbaum, the problem is that adults don't always leave the kids alone. Adults feel threatened by this kind of behavior, so they may call the police. Once the teen is arrested by the police, this triggers a process which Tannenbaum calls the dramatization of evil. This consists of putting the teen through a variety of official procedures designed to impress on him how serious this matter is, and during which everyone involved, police, lawyers, judges, witnesses, perhaps even the teen's own parents, all tell him that he is evil. His self-image is redefined. He's not a kid just testing his limits. He's a bad person. He's a criminal. He's what they used to call a juvenile delinquent, these days a young offender. Now, there are two possible responses to the dramatization of evil: the one society wants and the one society does not want. The one society wants is what these days is referred to as being scared straight. The kid is so terrified by all these authority figures making threats about what'll happen to him if he doesn't mend his ways that he never ever commits another crime again. However, there is another response, and that is simply that the child believes what all these adults are telling him. If all these high-powered authority figures are telling him that he's a bad person and a criminal, well, then they must be right. The kid redefines his self-image and starts to think of himself as a criminal. This in turn means that he starts to act like a criminal. The teen is labeled as a criminal, so the teen believes the label and becomes a criminal. In this way, the dramatization of evil acts as a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is a prophecy that comes true because you made it. The adults tell the teen that he's a criminal and prophesy that he is headed for a life of crime. The teen believes them and does embark on a life of crime. The prophecy comes true because it was made. Tannenbaum's work was the starting point for an approach which became known as labeling theory. In the 50s, Edwin Lemert made a similar argument regarding adults. Lemert distinguished between primary deviance and secondary deviance. In other words, between minor deviance and major deviance. Lemert argued that just about everybody occasionally commits acts of primary deviance, things like speeding, cheating on your income tax, doing illegal drugs, and so on. Like Tannenbaum, Lemert argued that this is normal. People are not angels. However, even though they are technically breaking the law, people who do this still have a self-image of themselves as basically law-abiding citizens. And so these minor crimes do not escalate into major crimes. However, if they're caught, then they too are put through the process that Tannenbaum called the dramatization of evil. Lemert did not use that term, but he did emphasize that being put through official procedures was extremely traumatizing for the average person. And the possible responses are the same. Some people will be scared straight, but others will believe they're evil and develop a criminal self-image which will lead them into secondary deviance and a life of crime. Still in the 50s, Harold Garfinkel focused on the role of official justice system procedures in creating both a criminal self-image and a criminal public image for defendants. He argued that procedures like arrest, incarceration, and trial all function as status degradation ceremonies, meaning they publicly take away the defendant's status as a law-abiding citizen and assign him a new, lower or degraded status, that of criminal. Moreover, said Garfinkel, our justice system has plenty of ceremonies to lower people's status, but none to raise it back up. When a person has paid their debt to society and completed their prison sentence, there is no ceremony saying, "Congratulations, welcome back to society." No, they're just told, "Get out." Indeed, we not only do not officially reinstate them as law-abiding citizens, we give them a criminal record, which in practice maintains their criminal status indefinitely. In the 60s, Irving Goffman argued that even a single conviction can leave a person with a permanent stigma or black mark. Goffman argued that if a person is stigmatized by being labeled as a criminal, then not only does the person themselves redefine their self-image, and not only does the justice system redefine their public image, but also every single person that the criminal has ever met redefines their image of him. They go through a process of retrospective reinterpretation, meaning they look back on all their previous interactions with that person looking for signs that there was always something wrong with that person. And if you look hard enough, you can always find something. Ah, yes, I always knew there was something off about him. Nothing specific, just the way he'd look at you, you know. And so his former friends want nothing to do with him, and indeed contribute to his public image as a criminal. Pretty soon, respectable people will not associate with him, and respectable employers will not hire him. The only people who will talk to him or offer him a job are his fellow criminals. And so he has no choice but to continue in his life of crime. The self-fulfilling prophecy comes true again. Still in the 60s, Howard Becker developed this idea into what he termed labeling theory. Becker argued that society applies labels to people, and that these labels largely determine the person's social status or social standing. Negative labels, such as the label of criminal, can have a very negative impact on the life of the person being labeled. Becker said that, normally, a person's status is a composite or combination of the statuses associated with the various roles which that person plays in society. So let's say Joe may be seen as a good father, but a lazy worker, but an enthusiastic little league coach, and so on. However, the label of criminal is so powerful that it becomes the person's master status. People who interact with him no longer care whether he's a good father or anything else. All they see when they look at him is a criminal. And so everyone treats him as a criminal. As a result, the label can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If he's defined and labeled as a criminal, he may be given no choice but to become a criminal. And then the labelers come to believe that they were right all along and that he's just a criminal type. Becker argued that while it is true that ultimately labels like criminal are applied by society as a whole, not everyone in society has an equal say in how these labels are defined and applied. Some people have much more say than others when it comes to defining terms and labeling people. Rich and powerful authority figures have far more influence over which labels society adopts than the average person. Becker's best-known book is Outsiders, published in 1963. In this book, Becker argued that marginal social groups, or what he termed outsiders, are often victimized by the authorities. They're given a negative label. This is similar to Goffman's concept of stigma, except that stigma is applied by society as a whole for Goffman, whereas labels are applied by specific authority figures whom Becker calls moral entrepreneurs. The term entrepreneur normally refers to a business person, but more broadly, it means anyone who profits or benefits from something. So, a moral entrepreneur is someone who benefits by pushing a particular brand of morality on society. This can be a politician, a business person, a judge, a religious leader, or any other well-known authority figure. The moral entrepreneur selects some minority group that is different from the majority of society in some way and declares that being different makes them deviant and immoral. He says that they're all criminals and that they're a terrible menace to society. He stirs up the public into what's termed a moral panic, which leads to a moral crusade to stamp out this terrible menace. And since he pointed out the menace, naturally, he has to be the one to lead the fight against it, which means society has to give him power and money to get it done. Well, for Becker, that power and money is the real object of the exercise. Becker argues that outsiders are not really a menace to society. Marginal social groups normally have neither the desire nor the resources to harm society. They're simply used by authority figures as scapegoats for society's problems and as a pretext to boost their own authority. Some moral entrepreneurs may genuinely believe that they have uncovered a menace to society, but most are just cynically manipulating the general public for their own benefit. Either way, the process of labeling creates a balanced form of social mobility. One social group goes up in society by pushing another social group down. Labeling has positive consequences for the labelers and negative consequences for the labeled. The rich and powerful become richer and more powerful by persecuting minority groups, and justify this by labeling them as criminals. All of this means that labeling theory turns the whole issue of crime on its head. Becker argues that at least when it comes to some crimes, the real problem lies not with the so-called criminals, but with the authorities. This idea made Becker very popular at the time because the 60s saw the rise of various protest movements in the US fighting against the man, the establishment, or the authorities. History's master labeler was probably Adolf Hitler. Hitler and the Nazis said, "Blame the Jews for all of Germany's problems," labeling them as an evil and degenerate race. And he rode this hate campaign to become ruler of Germany and nearly of the whole world. Once in power, he implemented the Holocaust, and so 6 million Jews died so that Hitler and the Nazis could make their bid for world domination. The Nazis rose up in society by pushing the Jews down in the most brutal fashion imaginable. After the Nazis lost the Second World War, Western politicians continued to use labeling. They just used other labels: socialist, communist, these days, terrorist. There's always some boogeyman that politicians can use to scare people into giving them more money and more power. However, Howard Becker did not examine Nazism. As an American, he focused on labeling in the US. He looked at several groups of outsiders in American society, including marijuana users. First of all, he just hung out with groups of stoners and quickly came to the conclusion that there was no way in which these people were a menace to society. Stoned people are more interested in ordering a pizza than robbing a bank. They may be doing some long-term harm to their own health, but it's their health and their business, and that is no reason to label them criminals. So Becker asked, why has the US criminalized marijuana use? And to answer that question, he looked at the history of the war on drugs. What he found was that before the 20th century, there were no laws criminalizing marijuana or any other psychoactive drugs anywhere in the world. People had been using them for thousands of years. Some religions even considered them sacred. And even in early 20th century America, there was no public outcry demanding the criminalization of drugs. Indeed, most Americans knew nothing about them. Rather, Becker found that the war on drugs was created from the top down. The US federal government created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and its agents created a propaganda campaign pushing for legislation banning drugs. By persuading a majority of the American people that drugs and drug users were a menace to society, this bureau could accumulate wealth and power until it had a budget in the billions of dollars and agents all over the world. A section of the US federal government grew richer and more powerful by putting thousands of people into jail for the so-called crime of altering their own consciousness with drugs. As always with labeling, some benefited at the expense of others. The Nazis' labeling campaign has often been termed the technique of the big lie. The war on drugs uses the same technique. The state's propaganda campaign has always massively exaggerated the health risks of psychoactive drugs, especially marijuana, which is by far the most widely used such drug. Scientific research has never supported the state's claims. In the 60s, the Office of the US Surgeon General issued a report stating that these health risks had been exaggerated and recommending the decriminalization of most drugs, especially marijuana. In the 80s, the Canadian Medical Association issued a similar report, declaring that for adults, the health risks of marijuana are, quote, minimal, unquote. As research into medical marijuana has been able to expand in recent years, it has been scientifically established that the health benefits of marijuana far outweigh its minimal health risks. I shall have more to say about the war on drugs in a subsequent talk. But the war on drugs is just one example of labeling. Unfortunately, politicians can always find some minority group, some group of outsiders, to blame all of society's problems on and to make into a terrible menace to society. They do it because the sad fact is that scare tactics work. In the words of the late great Warren Zevon, you're a whole different person when you're scared. If you can get the general public scared enough, they panic. They throw reason out the window. And they'll give you anything you ask for as long as you promise to protect them from this terrible menace. Moreover, the labeler claims that the labeled group have already harmed society by breaking social standards and laws, and demands retribution. In other words, he stirs up the public with cries for revenge. There is often a fine line in society between justice and revenge. As more and more people demand vengeance, hot-blooded emotion pushes reason aside and propels the labeler upwards in society. Labeling has been a route to wealth and power for a very long time, and it still is. So it's not going to go away anytime soon. Labeling theory shows us that meanings and definitions are not always arrived at through simple agreement. Sometimes they're arrived at through a process of violent struggle. Sometimes they're shaped by the interests of the rich and powerful. Sometimes the general public is lied to, and minority groups have to fight for a long time to make the truth known and to redefine their social reality. In every society, meaning and culture emerge from a combination of social cooperation and social conflict. However, while labeling can serve the interests of the rich and powerful, it can also serve the interests of society as a whole. Some people really are violent, dangerous, and a menace to society, and they need to be labeled as criminals. Society invented labeling as a way to help recognize threats and defend itself. So labeling can be a positive thing. But, like anything society invents, labeling can be used and it can be misused. It can be used to defend society against genuine threats, and it can be misused by authority figures to accumulate wealth and power by creating imaginary threats. But either way, one thing is clear: labels have power. Why? Because, as I've said before, subjective definitions have objective consequences. In the 1970s, Canadian Austin Turk built on Becker's work. Turk argued that every modern society can be divided into the authorities, who make the laws, and the subjects, to whom the laws are primarily applied. Turk argued that there's a constant power struggle between the two. The authorities are constantly trying to increase their control over society, while the subjects are constantly trying to increase their freedom from that control. This means that there's a social conflict over the law. Each side has its own norms and values, so there's a struggle over whose norms and values will be enforced by the law. And because there's a struggle, there's a balance of power which changes over time. And because of that, the law changes over time. The law always reflects the current state of social relations. In other words, the current balance of power between authorities and subjects. Because this is constantly changing, said Turk, the law can never be fixed once and for all. More than that, for Turk, there is no absolute standard of right or wrong, no absolute standard of what is normal or deviant. The law, morality, social norms all change over time as social relations change. The law is just one part of the larger social struggle between authorities and subjects. And the state of law enforcement at any time reflects the balance of power between them at that time. Turk's model is similar to the Marxist model of class struggle between the ruling class and the ruled class, except that Turk does not use the concept of social class. However, like Marxists, Turk emphasized the connection between the law and politics. He argued that if the law is seen as only serving the authorities, then when subjects break the law, this can be a primitive and inarticulate form of political action. Things like juvenile delinquency, vandalism, looting, and riots can all be forms of political protest. The perfect example of this is the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. In recent years, there's been a string of highly publicized cases of white police officers killing black suspects, either by shooting them or, in the case of George Floyd in 2020, kneeling on his neck until he couldn't breathe. In all of these cases, the suspects were eventually found to be either completely innocent or guilty of some very minor crime. And yet in all of these cases, no action was at first taken against any of the police officers involved. That was when black communities, beginning with Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, began to fight back. It had become clear to them that the justice system provided justice for white people only. And so they took the law into their own hands. They demanded justice for the dead. They organized protest marches, which sometimes turned into riots. And only after there was violence in the streets, Were the police officers responsible for those killings removed from duty? And some faced criminal charges. The officer who killed George Floyd received a 22-year jail sentence. In a perfect world, all of that could have been accomplished without violence. But in the real world, nothing was accomplished until after there was violence. In city after city, the pattern has been the same. A white cop kills a black suspect, the police do nothing, then there are riots, then the police do something. The police are supposed to be there to protect the community. But for black men, the police are a bigger danger to their lives than any criminals. The Black Lives Matter movement is saying that has to change. The biggest change so far has been in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed. The city council in 2020 voted to abolish the city's police department and replace it with a community-led alternative. This may sound radical, but it was actually suggested by British Marxists back in the 1980s. How it will work out remains to be seen. Turk also argued that different kinds of authorities have different kinds of power over the subjects. Politicians make the laws, but the criminal justice system enforces the law. The police are the first-line authorities. They are the first to investigate crimes and the first to make contact with potential suspects. As such, said Turk, it is the police who have the most power in the day-to-day decisions as to who is going to be defined as a criminal. On TV cop shows, the police always find incontrovertible factual evidence to prove who done it. But that's TV. In the real world, the facts of the case are often impossible to establish conclusively. This means that police officers can't just base themselves on the facts when deciding whether to arrest somebody. A number of studies have shown that in practice, police make arrests based primarily on their perception of the suspect. In simple terms, if the person makes a good impression on the cop, he lets them go. But if they make a bad impression, he arrests them or shoots them. Now, they may make a bad impression just due to their individual personality annoying the cop. But more often, it's because the suspect belongs to a social group, which the cop perceives negatively. Such negative perceptions generally arise from negative labels or stereotypes, which have been applied to that social group. A stereotype consists of a set of negative characteristics ascribed to all the members of a particular social group. Stereotypes are one-sided caricatures. They exaggerate the group's negatives and ignore their positives. And stereotypes are harmful because subjective definitions have objective consequences. If people, like the police, think of a certain social group in negative terms, then they're likely to treat them in a negative way. Now, people can be stereotyped in many different ways, but within the justice system, the most important stereotypes are those of class, gender, and ethnicity. It's been argued that basically the middle class make the rules for the working class, men make the rules for women, and whites make the rules for non-whites. So firstly, as regards class, numerous studies have found that the police treat middle-class suspects differently from working-class suspects. If the person is smartly dressed, has a nice house or a nice office, speaks in a respectful, educated manner, and so on, they are rarely charged with a crime. But if the suspect is wearing torn jeans and a black leather jacket, lives in a poor neighborhood, and worst of all, talks back to the cops, the police usually arrest him. The same has been found to apply to teenagers or young offenders. Moreover, the police regularly patrol poor neighborhoods and run so-called stop and search identity checks on anyone they see hanging out on the street. This is not done because the police actually expect to find evidence of a crime, but just to let them know that the police are watching them. This is harassment, and it's something the police would never dream of doing in middle-class suburbs. This class bias also extends into the courts. Judges are routinely more lenient on middle-class defendants who look respectable than on working-class defendants who look like criminal types. As regards gender, I shall have much more to say about that in the talk on feminism. For now, I just want to make a couple of points. First of all, women are much less likely to be sent to prison than men. In Canada today, only about 10% of the total prison population is female, and only about 2% of the federal prison population, where the long-term sentences are served, is female. However, this is not the whole story. While men are more likely to be sent to jail, women are more likely to be sent to a mental institution. Women who get in trouble with the law are more likely to be diagnosed as mentally ill, with the result that there are about 3 times as many women as men in Canada's mental institutions. Labeling theorists and feminists have argued that this is not because women actually have so much more mental illness. It's because gender stereotypes lead to different responses from the system. If teenage boys start engaging in vandalism, petty theft, and so on, they get labeled as young offenders and sent to jail. If teenage girls do the same thing, they get labeled as mentally ill and are sent to a mental institution. This is because male psychiatrists expect normal women to be passive, submissive, and dependent on men. So, if they start acting independently, well, then there must be something wrong with them. Often they are diagnosed with very vague categories like neurotic. This is the old double standard. Boys will be boys, but girls will be in need of therapy. In short, gender stereotypes lead to the use of different mechanisms of social control for men and women. Men go to jail, women go to the loony bin. Either way, disrupting public order gets both locked up. Finally, as regards ethnicity. In the US, African Americans are greatly overrepresented in jail, and we've briefly looked at the problems which led to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. At this point, unfortunately, I think there can be little doubt that racism is widespread in the US criminal justice system. In Canada, this racism is simply directed at a different ethnic minority, Indigenous people. They too are greatly overrepresented in our justice system. Indigenous people make up just under 5% of Canada's total population, but over 30% of our prison population. Numerous studies have concluded that the main reason for this is institutionalized racism. White police officers, lawyers, judges, and juries all tend to assume that Indigenous defendants are guilty until proven innocent, and that they deserve whatever they get. In Saskatoon, through at least the late 90s and early 2000s, police officers were in the habit of giving Indigenous suspects what were called starlight tours, which consisted of dumping them on the outskirts of town to walk home in freezing cold weather, which caused at least 2 of them to die of hypothermia. Canada's justice system has also failed to provide protection for Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women. The 2019 report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls documented thousands of Indigenous women who are missing and whose cases remain unsolved. To conclude on stereotypes, stereotypes of class, gender, and ethnicity have a significant impact on decisions made by police and judges. Classism, sexism, and racism exist in all societies, and police and judges are part of society. This means that in the criminal justice system, disadvantaged and stereotyped social groups are more likely to be incarcerated and are generally treated more harshly. Yet again, subjective definitions have objective consequences. Looking at stereotypes brings us to what is perhaps the central issue in labeling theory, namely, to what extent are labels created by the authorities, and to what extent are they created by society as a whole? Now, this is not always so easy to answer. For example, there's no question that Hitler and the Nazis launched a systematic campaign of labeling against the Jews. But this campaign would not have worked if they weren't building on anti-Semitic stereotypes which had existed in Germany for many centuries. The Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism, they just took advantage of it. The same applies to stereotypes in the justice system. Society as a whole invents the stereotypes, the justice system just enforces them. Here in Canada, for example, the police did not invent the drunken Indian stereotype, but they do act on it, frequently arresting Indigenous people for public drunkenness. Similarly, politicians clearly do apply labels to certain social groups, but those politicians will generally say that they're just responding to public sentiment and public demand. So the question of whether the label is invented by society or by the authorities is to a certain extent a chicken and egg question. My answer is, it's a bit of both. One criticism that's been leveled at labeling theory is the same criticism that I would level at all these theories. It provides only a partial explanation of crime. It can explain some crimes, but not others. For the most part, it can explain minor crimes like drug use better than major crimes like homicide. Also, it focuses on the authorities' reaction to crime, and so it can provide explanations for recidivism, but it has relatively little to say about the initial causes of most crimes. Also, subjectivists, of course, focus on the subjective causes of crime, like motivations and definitions, but they don't examine the objective causes of crime, like poverty. The other major criticism that's been leveled at labeling theory is that it is one-sided in its negative assessment of labels. Yes, labels can be harmful, but they can also be beneficial to society. Society needs to recognize and label genuine threats so that it can defend itself against them. Indeed, social stigmatization or labeling is one of the oldest punishments of mankind. In Genesis, the first book of the Bible, when Cain kills his brother Abel, God puts a mark on his forehead so that everyone shall know that he is a murderer. The mark of Cain is one of the oldest known examples of labeling. For thousands of years in agricultural societies, such marks were physically put on the bodies of criminals through branding or whipping or chopping off some body part. These days, we don't do that. Instead, we apply labels through paperwork, official records, such as a criminal record. In addition to being a lot less painful, this has the advantage that it can be wiped out if the person behaves themselves for a certain amount of time. It's been argued that these days labeling can even be beneficial to the person being labeled because it can take the place of harsher punishment. In Canada, the majority of first offenders for all but the most serious crimes are not sent to jail, but are instead released on probation. This means that they've been found guilty and labeled as a criminal, then released to face public disapproval, shame, and humiliation. This negative social reaction may be enough to motivate them to turn away from a life of crime. In conclusion, labeling has its pros and its cons because any social institution that can be used can be misused. Labeling can be used to warn society about genuine threats or misused to panic society about imaginary threats. It can be used to help provide justice for all or misused to help provide wealth and power for a few. One thing is clear, society will continue to apply and misapply labels. And society will continue to fight about the definitions of those labels. The central contribution of labeling theory is to point out that crime is an interactive process, an interaction between authorities and criminals, between labelers and labeled. We need to understand both sides to understand crime. Sociologists cannot just accept that the authorities are the good guys and criminals are the bad guys. Sometimes the authorities are the bad guys, as with Hitler and the Nazis. In early Canada and the US, the colonial governments were the bad guys who treated indigenous people in an appalling fashion and justified it with labels like savages, barbarians, and so on. Since then, things have improved for indigenous people, but as we've seen, stereotypes and discrimination persist. Labels have power because, altogether now, subjective definitions have objective consequences. That concludes what I have to say about the subjectivist approach to criminal justice. A transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day all.